Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is all roads lead to Denerim in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 21 Duncan's shifty little menagerie. And so, there we are sneaking around in an off-limits area, trying to be as quiet as possible because, hey, Templars have beheaded people for less when Jowan suddenly yelps. Did you fry him? Almost, yeah. Khazar smirked. First because I thought we were under attack. Then, when I turned and just saw him just standing there, I almost fried him because he'd yelped. While we were risking our heads going after his phylactery. Garrot leaned back against the column, surveying the mountain view as they talked. The pair had found this quiet little corner of the king's camp not long after the whole poison the Templars bit had gone the way of the Tags. Apparently, the Chantry had herbalists who could identify cave spider venom when presented with it. Who knew? Fortunately, Garrot had noticed quick enough to split the scene, dragging the kid behind him with only some mild hissing and spitting on the elf's part. A duck around a tumbled wall and a hop up to a balcony later, and they'd found this hidden little edge of the ruin that was well out of the paths and views of any metal-covered humans who hadn't liked a little extra seasoning in their lunches. The fact that the isolated hiding spot happened to have a spectacular view of the Korkari wilds was only a happy happenstance. So, Garrot glanced over at his elven partner in crime. Why'd he yelp? I couldn't tell at first. Something bit me, he kept saying, and he started swatting at the ground with his staff. I was like, hello, Jowan. You're an apprentice mage. Just fire some lightning at it or get over it. Garrot chuckled. Did he do either? Didn't need to. As it turned out, he was right. Something had bit him. And then it had the unmitigated gall to bite me. Ah. Garrot eyed the remembered annoyance on the mage's face. Let me guess, it never lived long enough to learn better. Damn straight. On pure reflex, I shoot out a blast of lightning. Khazar illustrated by doing so now, electricity leaping from his hands to crackle into the air in front of them. A moment later, it dissipated. Next thing I know, I see a half-dozen little two-legged lizard things just emerge from the shadows and fall to the ground, dead. Garrot laughed full-bellied, because he recognized that description. The little vermin had a tendency of getting into the tunnels around Dust Town and making a mess of the refuse. Deep stalkers, eh? Yeah, they do that. The elf wrinkled his nose. Is that what they were? Annoying little things. He paused thoughtfully. Fun to kill, though. Tell me about it. Garrot flipped his dagger idly as he spoke. Me and the other Duster kids used to make a game out of chasing the things. 1 point for a kill, 2 for a live capture. 10 points if you managed to get one of your catches to spit acid on another player. Khazar threw back his head and laughed. And to think, the most fun game I had back at the tower was, hide the enchanter's staff. Garrot smirked at his younger companion. Why do I get the feeling that's not nearly as dirty as I'm imagining it? Because I've played it since I was 7, you sick and twisted dwarf. Garrot simultaneously laughed and gagged. By the stone, that was a nasty thing to say. Even for you, you evil, evil elf. And now the image will stay in your mind forever. Khazar smiled devilishly. My work here is done. Truth be told, Garrot liked the mage. He was a little snippy, sure, and Garrot didn't want to be on the receiving end of his spells anytime soon, dwarven resistance to magic be damned, but the kid was overall a lot more tolerable than the other goody two-shoes. Like that other mage and the knight. And that wasn't even touching on the princess. Khazar had a sense of mischief and a disdain for authority for its own sake that the Duster related to. Also, like Garrot, the elf had a bit of a mean streak. Garrot approved. Thought I heard someone cast lightning over this way. A familiar voice came into earshot behind them, somewhere on the other side of the pillar they were hiding behind. Garrot stifled a chuckle when Khazar groaned softly and started banging his head against the stone. Or maybe I'm just losing my mind, tends to happen, you know, around bad-tempered mage runts who can't take a hint. The last bit was delivered in a shout, obviously for their benefit. Khazar sighed and raised his own voice. Go away, Templar. Ex-Templar, thank you very much. Alistair's blonde head poked around the column. And there you are. Enjoying the view, are you? I was before your ugly face got in the way. Oh, what a clever comeback. Don't think I'll top that. Now come on, time to go. Khazar bristled, and Garot saw a couple sparks started coming off his hands, as they tended to do every now and then. Or what? I'm not some dog you can order around, you know. Me, a new voice spoke up behind Alistair. I like dogs, I do. This was followed by an actual dog's bark. Curious, Garot stood up and started around the column to see just who the warden had brought with him. As soon as he moved, Alistair jumped. By the dash. Don't do that, Garot. Garot smirked, pushing past Alistair to see the landing proper. What, walk? Oh, haha. Like you don't know what I mean, you lurky person. He heard Khazar chuckle at Alistair's discomfort. Behind the warden was a small group of strangers. Judging by the dust on their armor, they'd just come off the road, and the plates of camp food they were each working on only confirmed it. Two of them had that distinct not on the up and up look that Garot recognized as akin to his own. If they'd been dwarves and branded, he would have taken them for dusters, but they weren't either. One was tall and human, with a longbow slung across his back and a cheeky grin on his scruffy face. The other was an elf, who Garot's keen eyes noted had a dagger on each forearm and what appeared to be a lock-picking kit tucked into his belt. Behind them stood another human and a dog. The human was blond and thicker set than the other two, more along the lines of Alistair's build. He had a long sword and shield stowed on his back, and wore armor that indicated access to decent craftsmen. No mere sword grunt, there. While the other two were grinning, this one bore an expression that was both listless and careworn. It was the sort of expression a guy saw a lot, in Dust Town. It said that the person had been through a lot of crap, and was about one bad hair day away from either trying to scratch the eyes out of the nearest cast member or throwing himself on his own dagger. Interesting. Next to the blonde man stood a dog that was very nearly as tall as Garot. He'd seen a lot of Maberry since their arrival almost a week ago, and he didn't much like seeing one off a leash like this. Scary things, Maberry. And why too smart? The elf of the newbies smiled in a way that was likely supposed to be friendly. How do you do? We're the new warden recruits. So the boss scrounged up more, eh? Garot smirked at Alistair. Pretty soon, we're gonna outnumber you actual wardens. So watch your back, Goldie. Ah, so that's your plan, is it? Going to take over the wardens from the bottom up? Alistair rejoined. Always good for a bit of banter, was Alistair. Can't say I mind, but watch your back when you get to Duncan. He'll school all of you at once, just you wait. The human thief burst out laughing. Learned that firsthand. Man, but the old bugger can run, can't he? Alistair turned a worried look on the human. Do I want to know why you were running from Duncan? Cut his purse, the man deadpanned. Had to run, or else he'd have caught me sooner, wouldn't he? Garot couldn't help it, he threw back his head and roared with laughter. The mental image. And the way the cut purse admitted it so baldly, in front of Goody Two-Shoes Alistair. Is he all right? Garot heard the new elf asked when his laughter didn't abate. Oh, the other wardens told me about this. Alistair said. Apparently, he's out of his bloody mind, fits in rather nicely with the rest of them, really. I resent that. Khazar's voice snipped. He'd come out from behind the pillar, and now stood with his arms crossed over his chest. He scowled at Garot. And you shouldn't be encouraging him. You're supposed to be on my side. Garot took some deep breaths and mastered himself. He smirked up at the mage. You know, I'm noticing a couple things about Duncan. Recruiting a guy who cut his purse. He pointed to the human. A kid who helped a blood mage escape. Pointing to Khazar. A fella who worked for the local crime lord. Pointing to himself. And who knows who else? He turned his smirk to Alistair. Duncan's a little shifty, ain't he? But, it's... Alistair sputtered. At this, the new elf laughed. I'd noticed that, too. You know, he plucked me out of the hands of the Denerim guard right as they were about to arrest me. Same song here, elf, Garot said. The elf was amiable enough, Might as well make nice. Name's Garot Braska. Finian Tabri. The elf glanced about at his companions. And this fine upstanding citizen is Davith. Behind us are Hugo and his pet human, Percival. The only acknowledgement the human behind them gave that he'd heard was to reach down and scratch them a berry behind its ears. How about you? Finian turned to Khazar, who had remained silent and smoldering the entire time. It's good to see another elf among the dash. Garot suppressed a snort before the explosion hit, knowing that was entirely the wrong thing to say. Us both having pointed ears, the mage interrupted flatly, does not make us kin. Finian, to his credit, recovered quickly. He turned apologetic so swiftly and smoothly that Garot leaned forward, reassessing the elf's demeanor. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sound like I assumed we were. You've got a staff, you're a mage, aren't you? Must be a strong one, to catch Duncan's attention. By the stone, did the elf just do what Garot thought he did? Khazar's guard relaxed slightly. Of course I am. In fact, I'm one of the most talented mages of my generation. Finian smiled abashedly, and Garot narrowed his eyes, the gears in his head turning. Admittedly, I don't know much about magic. I don't know how you could, the way the chantry keeps everyone locked up in the tower. Khazar was speaking freely now, his previous hostility completely forgotten. They barely even let us learn about magic, and that's only because we'd probably unwittingly pull Ferelden into the fate if we didn't. While Khazar continued to rant, Garot only stared with new respect at the smiling, seemingly unassuming elf in front of him. This elf had just cooled, with a few words, one of the hottest heads in camp. Or rather, he'd redirected the heat, like a master smith redirecting his fire so that he could use it to serve his own purposes. Very interesting. When Khazar had wound down ending with a note somewhere along the lines of, and that's why all chantry priests need to die painful fiery deaths, the ex-Templar stepped forward. Well, that was informative. Anyway, believe it or not, you two, I didn't just come here for the company and promises of mass murder. Garot smirked. Ah, I'm hurt. The fact is, Duncan's back. At that, both stood a bit straighter. Turns out he's done building an army of new recruits, and is ready to put you all through the joining. He wants to get the ritual done by tonight, so the sooner we get started, the better. Khazar sighed. Finally. So the boss wants to see us. Garot guessed. Yep. Alistair nodded. As soon as possible, all gathered together for the first time. Quite touching, really. A moment that bards will sing about for years. Finian agreed with that disarming grin of his. So he bantered too, did he? Well, let's get going, then. Alistair made a shooing motion, and they all started off toward the middle of camp. If we take too long, he'll give us his disappointed warden commander look. Believe me, you do not want to be on the receiving end of that little gem. Finian's riposte was quick. Know that from experience, huh? I do try to live as an example to the rest of you. Mostly, a cautionary one. Finian and Davith both laughed. Khazar, trailing behind even Percival and the dog, just wrinkled his nose. Garot drew even with the new elf as they walked. Softly, he said, you are one manipulative son of a nug, ain't ya? The lollygag grin on his face faded slightly, and he shrugged nonchalantly. I just want everyone to get along. With you. Hey, Garot. Alistair called back. Garot's head snapped up. No way had the guy heard that brief exchange. Yeah. You haven't seen Mila about, have you? She's the only recruit we haven't found yet. Garrett snorted a laugh, though he was aware of how the mage behind them hissed at the sound of the Dalish elf's name. What, you're actually looking in camp for her? Alistair groaned. That's what I was afraid of. Relax, Goldie. From what I saw in the deep roads, Reg's a decent tracker. He can probably pick up her trail. Won't need it, Khazar grumbled from behind them. When they glanced back at them, he pointed over toward the wall that separated the ruin from the wilds. There seemed to be a giant lizard of some kind dead on the ground beneath it. As Garot watched, the Dalish elf's lithe form landed lightly next to it and stumbled a step, having jumped off the top of the wall. What the? Alistair groaned and raised his voice. Mila, is that how you've been getting out? Climbing over the wall? And that doesn't seem a mite bit dangerous to you. The Dalish only acknowledged the question with a cursory glance in their direction. Then, she picked up her dead lizard and started off in the direction of the mess tent. Pleasant girl, Mila Mahariel. Talkative. Friendly. Alistair sighed. You guys go on and report to Duncan. I'm going to go see if I can't convince her to stay in camp long enough to meet us there. Garrot chuckled, and Khazar mumbled something under his breath. The other three only looked on in confusion, though there was definitely awe in Finian's expression as he watched the Dalish elf weave through the camp. First Khazar's sulking when she didn't want to make friends, and now Finian's semi-reverent staring? What was it with elves and their fascination with the Dalish? It was like Mila was a bloody paragon or something. Khazar was the first to continue on toward camp, expression dangerously close to murderous, and to Garrot, Karda thug, murderous was not just a figure of speech. The dwarf followed behind, though he let himself turn to watch Alistair try to catch up to the Dalish elf. It proved well worth the attention as the warden nearly bowled over a messenger, and the dwarf chuckled. The other three followed behind him and Khazar, speaking quietly amongst themselves. Or rather, the two shoddier ones were speaking, while Percival followed behind in brooding silence. The dog seemed to be attending to the conversation more than he was. Garrot narrowed his eyes at the dog, again wondering how smart it was. And how vicious. He'd have to step lightly around the hound, because a dog as big as a dwarf could easily tear his head off. He rather liked his head where it was. It was useful. He turned his attention forward again. As far as he was concerned, that dog wasn't the only one to keep an eye on out of the new batch of recruits. Davith didn't really seem wily enough to be much of an actual threat to anyone without a bulging purse, so Garrot wasn't really worried about him. No, it was the other two. Finian, that elf was crafty. Garrot had seen a lot of someone else in the elf's quick responses, the way he could change course mid-conversation, and bring you along for the ride. The way he could talk his way around a volatile situation when pressed. It reminded him of Birat. And anyone who reminded him of Birat, no matter how seemingly benevolent, was someone to be watched. Percival, on the other hand, wasn't much of a threat, now. But Garrot had seen that look before. He was hanging on to sanity by a thin thread. If that thread snapped, and who could say what would make it do so, then the blond man was just as likely to go berserk as he was to throw himself off a cliff. And if Duncan had recruited him, it was a fair bet he knew how to use that fine blade on his back. Garrot didn't relish the thought of being mowed down by some depressed pretty boy who couldn't handle a couple punches from the bitch known as life. Garrot, for his part, took any punches life threw at him. And then he laughed in her face. Thinking about the sorts of people he'd be expected to work with from now on, he just hoped the bitch wasn't laughing back. 22 The first quest. Marnan walked Jory through the motion again. It is a downward cleave, Sir Jory. Of course your body is exposed for the duration of the swing. The point is that when it connects, any vulnerability on your part does not matter. Jory shook his head, glancing around as if for help, first at Duncan, then at Felicity. Felicity watched with the curiosity that was characteristic of her, absorbing the technique even though the mage would likely never use it herself. Duncan, however, merely watched with the impassive expression of a casual observer. It just doesn't seem like a safe maneuver. It can't be good for your shoulder joints. Marnan rolled her eyes in exasperation. She respected Ser Jory well enough, but the man was far too cautious. He'd obviously never had to fight tooth and nail for the right to exist as the dwarves did. Neither is being devoured by dark spawn. And that is what will happen if you do not use everything you have to defeat them. Any given half-hearted swing is not going to tear through an ogre's hide. This. She demonstrated the cleave again. Is. And that, I can say with the confidence of experience. You've fought an ogre. Felicity said with some surprise from her seat beside Duncan. And killed it. She looked pointedly at Ser Jory. With a downward cleave. Ser Jory sighed and sat down on a log across the fire from Duncan and Felicity. I'm sorry. Yes, I suppose it's a fair enough maneuver, but it's just not my usual style. He dug the tip of his great sword into the dirt and leaned on it. I'll see if I can't find an opportunity to give it a try on the field, though. There was a brief silence. Then, as was customary for her, Felicity broke it with an unintentionally intrusive question. When did you fight an ogre? When Marnan did not immediately reply, the mage forged on. It's just, I understand that they're only seen during blights. Or, at least, that's what some sources say. So it must have been recently. Unless the sources are wrong, which wouldn't be surprising, since the tower never kept many dwarven accounts. Are there ogres in the deep roads between blights? There must be, or they'd die out between blights, I suppose. Do dash. Felicity, Marnan said firmly. Enough. The mage's mouth snapped shut, and she had the grace to look embarrassed. I did it again, didn't I? I apologize. Marnan nodded and was glad to have the subject dropped. While it was true that she made ample use of her fighting experience here, she did not like to go into the specific details of her battles, not in front of people who didn't know who she was or rather, who she had been. Because if she told them the specifics like her height in the command structure then they were bound to guess at least part of it. Marnan preferred to stay a nobody here. Here, she was just a warrior with a decent amount of field experience. No expectations based on caste, or upbringing, or who she was related to. The only ones who knew the truth were the handful of grey wardens from the deep roads and Garot Broska. The wardens had tacitly agreed to keep her identity secret. Broska, on the other hand, seemed to be hoarding her secret, waiting for the correct moment to use it to his advantage. She would have to be careful not to give him the opportunity. It was a dance that she'd learned well, growing up a noble in Orzammar, though apparently not well enough to avoid that single dagger in the back that had removed her from Orzammar in the first place. And there was the duster now, appearing when summoned like a bad omen. He had Khazar and the new recruits with him, though she noted that Alistair was nowhere to be seen. Alistair had brought the recruits by 20 minutes ago while Marnan and Jory had been with the soldiers, the former laying out effective techniques for killing darkspawn without getting infected. The blonde warden had pulled the two recruits aside and introduced the new trio, then told them to meet at Duncan's tent in the center of camp. The new elf, Finian, seemed friendly enough, and Davith was rather honest for a thief, if a bit too candid for his own good. Percival made her curious, however. The young man bore a crest on his shield, spotted only as the group was walking away. When they had seen it, Ser Jory had pointed out that it was the crest of Highever, and explained that that was one of the noble holdings of Ferelden. Ser Jory had then commented that the man's gear didn't match the usual design of a common Highever soldier, and that custom gear meant the man was likely a knight that served the nobility directly, or a noble himself. Marnan wondered which he was, knight or noble. Curiously, she couldn't seem to detect any indicators either way. I heard there's a party here, the casteless said smoothly, coming to a stop at Jory's shoulder and leaning against it. But you all look stone sober. Looks like I was lied to again. Duncan smiled. Hello again, Garot. Good to see you well. Same to you, boss. And you as well, Khazar, the warden commander greeted as the elf in question sat on the bench next to Jory. I must admit, I was rather surprised to return to Ostagar and find that your casualty list only consisted of some practice equipment in a crate. Khazar merely breathed an agitated sigh through his nose and glared at the fire. But where are Alistair and Mila? I had assumed she would be coming back with you. Marnan saw Felicity open her mouth, no doubt to tell Duncan all about just where Mila likely was, and was not. Here, Duncan. Alistair's voice called before the mage could speak. Marnan was not the only one to be surprised at seeing Mila trotting dutifully at the junior warden's heels. Jory startled and did a double take, and Felicity's jaw dropped so low that it may as well have been dragging on the ground. Marnan, however, did a double take for a different reason than Jory. The Dalish elf looked pale. A great deal paler than she had been a couple days before. And had she lost weight in the intervening time as well? Marnan's eyes narrowed as alarm bells tolled in her head. Ah, good. Duncan nodded a greeting to the late arrivals and stood. Now that we are all here, we may begin. He turned a stern eye to Alistair. Assuming, of course, that you're quite finished riling up the mages, Alistair. This evoked a sharp laugh from the elven mage across the fire. What can I say? Alistair said with a bashful smile. The Holy Mother ambushed me. The way she wields guilt, they should stick her in the army. Marnan chuckled at that one. She forced you to sass the mage, did she? We cannot afford to antagonize anyone, Alistair. We don't need to give anyone more ammunition against us. Alistair sighed. You're right, Duncan. I apologize. It was said with all the sincerity of a child scolded for stealing cookies. Marnan wasn't the only one to smirk at Alistair. Even not knowing the context of the younger warden's slip, she could well imagine what sort of trouble he'd been pressed into. She had fought alongside houses who were secretly warring with one another at the same time they were battling the Darkspawn. She could well imagine that similar politics arose on the surface as well. Now, then, let us not waste any more time, Duncan said, unspoken apology in his voice. You will all be headed into the Korkari Wilds to perform 2 tasks. First, each of you must obtain a vial of Darkspawn blood. Darkspawn blood? Felicity repeated, eyes wide. Why would we need Darkspawn blood? The Duster snorted a laugh. Probably for this ritual that's so secret. Right, boss. Yes, that is correct. Though I can't say more about it yet. But... Felicity clenched her fists. But isn't that dangerously close to blood magic? Why, because it has blood in it. Khazar snapped. Unless you decide to stab yourself and pull magic from your own body, no. It's not blood magic. That still skirts dangerously close, though. The Tevinter Imperium was fond of blood magic, and it was they that released the Darkspawn into the world in the first place. Propaganda. Enough, both of you, Duncan said. If you are having second thoughts, Felicity, I beg you to speak up now, because there will be no turning back later. Felicity lowered her eyes and shook her head. No, Duncan. I was merely concerned. I know. He raised his voice to address the rest of them. That warning carries to the rest of you. Becoming a Grey Warden is not a decision to be taken lightly, and is not one you can undo. If you are having doubts, speak up now. You may not get the chance later. Everything was silent but for the crackling of the fire and the barking of the dogs in their kennels. Then, the one called Davith chuckled quietly. Well, I wager that's your answer right there, isn't it? What is the second task? Marnan asked. Duncan nodded, a brief, proud smile flickering over his features. There was once a Grey Warden archive in the wilds, abandoned long ago. It has recently come to our attention that some scrolls have been left behind. Alistair, I want you to retrieve these scrolls if you can. I think I have seen such a building, said Mila. She stood on the edge of the circle, setting herself apart from the group. It is overgrown and given to the wilderness, but there are still some stores of information inside. I do not doubt it. You, Mila, can lead them to the archive. Mila nodded dutifully, but Marnan protested. Is that wise? The Dalish elf turned a stony glare down at her. You object to an elf leading you, Durgan Len. Marnan was insulted by the implication, but she let it slide for more important matters. No, I object to someone who is ill leading us. Marnan turned to Duncan. Perhaps it would be best if she stay here, in camp. We can retrieve a vial of blood for her. Davith scratched his stubble. I'd assumed that killing the Darkspawn was also part of the test. In that, Davith, Duncan said, you are correct. I apologize, Marnan, if you find this disconcerting dash. Not disconcerting. Unwise. A military force must be strong, with all members in the best shape possible, because it only takes one weak arm to break the line. This woman is ill. That means she will not be performing at her best. Do not speak of me as if I am not here, Durgan Len. Do you disagree? At some point, Marnan had risen to her feet. The effect was perhaps less effective here, among the physically taller topsideers, but it got her point across all the same. You are much paler than 3 days ago, and I suspect that you are trembling, even now. You are strong, elf, far stronger than most warriors I've known to go through this. But to me, it is obvious that you are finally succumbing to the taint. At last, Mila showed an emotion other than cold disdain when her eyes widened in surprise. Then, she turned her stony glare to Alistair. "You told." "In my defense, I never actually said the word taint," Alistair said weakly. "I just said you couldn't be healed with magic," and the senior enchanter drew her own conclusions. They just happened to be the correct ones. "Marnan, right?" a soft voice said, and the dwarf saw that the elf, Finian, stood at her elbow. "The rest of us are hardly defenseless. Maybe this can be considered another part of the test. You know, working as a team, so that even the weakest of us succeeds." Mila's hard look shifted to him. "Are you calling me weak, Flat-ear?" The castless one laughed. "Easy, elf. He's on your side." Marnan considered that for a moment, because she supposed it was a bit more tolerable if she thought of it like that. She sighed, because this was a battle she wasn't likely to win. She knew when to retreat. "Very well, then," she relented. Duncan nodded, but Felicity spoke before he could. "What are on these scrolls you wish retrieved?" "Old treaties, if you're curious. Promises of support made to the Grey Wardens long ago." Duncan sighed, his expression wry. "Though once only formalities, I suspect it may now be a good idea to have something to remind many of their commitments to us." "Who would be foolish enough to forget?" Marnan asked. Felicity shook her head. "I'm afraid the Darkspawn threat isn't quite as clear up here as it is in the Deep Roads, Marnan. Up here, the Darkspawn are largely considered defeated, and blights only seem to happen in history books." Finian nodded. "Let's hope the whole of Ferelden never has to learn differently." "Enough talk," Khazar said, looking up at Duncan with fire in his eyes. "Let's just get to the part where we fry some Darkspawn." It seemed such a perfect summation of the upcoming quest that Duncan dismissed them with that. 23 The Korcari Wilds. It took about 20 minutes out in the Korcari Wilds for Finian to realize that he was out of his league. He'd been a passing decent fighter, for an alienage elf. His mother had taught him dual wielding, and he'd practiced in secret after her death to keep his skills sharp. It had come in handy during the whole Ban Von fiasco, and in the days since, while fighting off bandits and wild animals on the road. Suffice to say, he knew his way around the pointy end of a dagger, which was more than most city elves could say. But the thing was, he had nothing on some of the powerhouses he now fought alongside. "Take out the archers!" Marnan cried, her war axe a blur of whirling death around her. She hacked at the knees of Darkspawn twice her size, creating a pile of tumbled creatures surrounding her. A pile that Ser Jorri was quick to take advantage of with that great sword of his. The way the knight wielded that thing, he made cutting limbs from bodies look as easy as cutting up a carrot for dinner. Marnan seemed to slip into the leading role by default. When they set out from camp, she had taken the rank of their party directly behind Mila's lead, putting Marnan next to Alistair, who, by contrast, had been grumbling that he hated being in front. Obviously, she had experience fighting Darkspawn, something to do with being a dwarf, Finian understood. He couldn't guess at the details, though. His education wasn't that great. Ser Jorri did not have the experience, obviously. He was a prototypical warrior, all muscle power and not much by way of brains. Finian's first meeting with the guy had involved him saying something obvious about Finian being an elf, and then bumbling through a sideways apology while said elf simply looked on, amused. "Do not order me around," Mila cried in response to Marnan's command, even as she hopped nimbly onto a rock and raised her bow. The draw and release was a smooth, single motion, and then one of the Hurlock archers on the ridge above them suddenly had an arrow sticking out of its eye. When they'd left the Ostagar camp, the Dalish elf had led them through the wilds with the sure feet of someone familiar with one's surroundings, far more so than Davith had been. Finian still couldn't shake his wonder at that thought, a Dalish elf. Mila was a real, living Dalish elf. All the things he'd wondered about his heritage over the years, all the times he'd wondered what it would be like to live away from the Shems. He had so many questions he needed to ask her. But now, hip-deep in a Darkspawn ambush as they were, was obviously not the time. "Nice shot, elf." Davith crowed as a second of Mila's arrows struck home. He was on a small ridge nearby, shooting at the same group she was. Finian noticed a genlock sneaking up behind his fellow thief, but a shadow moved and then Garrot was on its back. The dwarf buried his hand axe in the back of the Genlock's neck while his dagger flitted around to the creature's vital points. The monster fell without Davith ever noticing the scuffle right behind him, and Garrot ducked off into the bushes and disappeared again. Finian wasn't sure how to react to Garrot Braska. The dwarf had proven himself exceptionally keen when he'd called Finian out on his silver tongue within mere minutes of meeting him. Finn still wasn't sure how to feel about that. The insinuation that Finn played his word games purely for his own benefit, it couldn't be true. Could it? Finian dodged a charging Hurlock, and resolved not to dwell on it right now. They had been ambushed from all sides while in the bottom of a wide gully, with darkspawn shooting from the ridge above and coming at them from both ends of the ravine. The swamp made footing treacherous and wet, so Finian had to be careful as he moved around the crowd of darkspawn circling Percival. He picked off a Hurlock by stabbing it in the side, but it grabbed his arm and yanked him down as it fell. Finian landed on top of the dying darkspawn and kicked out at the snarling thing, getting out of its reach. He rolled back to his feet, now coated with swamp sludge. Ow! Alistair's voice called from ahead. Why do they keep attacking me? Perhaps because you present a strategic disadvantage on their part with your current placement. Is that Magi talk for, I'm in their way? Alistair had placed himself in the center of one of the ravine outlets, blocking any darkspawn who thought to come through that way. For all his complaining about being in front, he seemed content to form the solid shield that protected the rest of the party from oncoming threats. Overall, Finian liked Alistair. The man had a healthy sense of humor that Finian rather enjoyed using as a springboard for his own. If given the chance, he suspected the two of them might devolve into an endless cycle of purportedly witty banter that would only stop when someone cut out one of their tongues. Felicity was right behind the ex-Templar, using him rather shamelessly as a living shield. Occasionally, she ducked around him to fire a bolt of light at an incoming enemy, but she then flitted behind him just as quickly again. As Finian watched, Alistair took a nasty stab to the armpit from a Hurlock's sword. Felicity simply reached in and put a hand on his shoulder, and blood stopped flowing from the wound. That is quite handy, Alistair said as he bashed his shield into the creature that had stabbed him. You mages are all right. I think I'll keep you around. I am glad you approve, Felicity said with some amusement. Felicity, too, Finian liked, in an amusing sort of way. The mage was curious and talkative, not unlike Finian himself. The difference, of course, was that Felicity had spent her entire life studying hundreds of dusty old tomes, and all that book learning seemed to just tumble out of her at the slightest provocation. When Alistair's tour had run into her, Finian had made the mistake of asking her about the potion she had been in the process of mixing. The ensuing lecture on the history of rock salve and its varying non-traditional uses had been utterly exhausting, though he'd tried to remain polite and attentive. Alistair had been holding back laughter during the whole thing. A growl sounded behind Finn, and he spun away from a genlock that had snuck up on him. It waved a serrated broadsword viciously at Finn, and he, with his little daggers, could only jump back and hope the genlock stopped swinging long enough to give him an opening. It proved unnecessary, however, when Hugo went barreling into the genlock from the side, taking it down in a blur of teeth and pure canine muscle. Finn grinned and saluted the hound, silently promising him lots more games of fetch in the future. While Alistair, Jory, and Marnan seemed to have the ones who came from ahead under control, it was up to Finian, Percival, and the dog to stop the stream of monsters behind them from coming through. Percival in battle was, a little scary, to be honest. Finian was fighting close enough to him to see the dark, heated expression on his face as his sword danced around him. The sword was a deadly piece of work, wielded with a strange mix of easy skill and unrelenting brutality. But it was the dark intensity that glittered in the noble's eyes that discomfited the elf, and intrigued him. Percival was dangerous. It made something in him flutter. Finian, all the while, flitted around among Percival's opponents, doling out backstabs and cheap shots with his daggers wherever possible, and then dodged out of range before any of the creatures could retaliate. Again, he was competent. But nowhere near the courage and skills of his soon-to-be comrades. Finian snuck behind a pair of genlocks who were heading for Percival. The elf stabbed first one, then the other in the back. The first stumbled and fell, but the other turned and brandished a mace at the elf. Finian was too slow, and took a stinging blow in the side that had him stumbling sideways, right into a massive hurlock a head taller than him. The hurlock growled, and Finian could smell its rancid breath. He attempted to scramble away, only to be blocked in by the genlock. The hurlock swung its massive hammer at Finian, and he dropped to the ground on reflex, feeling the wind of the hammer sail over him. Then, the air above him cracked and flashed, and Finian looked up to see both darkspawn that had been menacing him twitching and falling as lightning raced over their forms. Nearby, he heard an exhilarated whoop. For all that collective prowess among the other recruits, it was nothing, compared to the walking apocalypse that was Khazar Surana. He was laughing now, standing safely in the center of the melee fighters, despite the fact that most of the darkspawn seemed to want to get past the sturdier members to go after him. Finian couldn't say he blamed the darkspawn for that. As soon as the ambush had made itself known, the other fighters had drawn their weapons and waited. Khazar, however, had raised his hands and shot a chain of fireballs up at the archers above them, decimating most of them instantly in a fiery explosion. Even now, lightning bolts danced across the battle, instantly scorching unsuspecting enemies mid-charge. More explosions rocked the air while Khazar blasted any darkspawn who clustered at the choke points on both ends of the ravine. The most destructive elements of nature danced at his fingertips, then swept forward to do his bidding. All the while, he laughed, apparently having the time of his life. Khazar Surana confused Finian a little, just because he'd never run into anyone who had so very little care for what others thought of him. Well, except maybe Ban Vaughn, but that was another case of someone who confused him. At least Khazar was a predictable sort of confusing, arrogant, self-absorbed, and with a bit of a violent side. A violent side evidenced by the glee with which he spun and charbroiled a trio of darkspawn menacing Marnan. Finian could only thank their lucky stars that the mage was on their side, climb to his feet, and dive back into the melee. Finally, the last of the attackers fell to Mila's arrows, and everyone sighed in relief. Alistair knelt and wiped his blade off on the grass. As he did so, he turned a raised eyebrow at Khazar. "Just so you know, that laughing thing. Very creepy." The elven mage was, grinning at Alistair. That was a new development. "You know us mages, going mad with power and everything. I'm sure it's nothing your Templar training couldn't handle." Yeah, sure. That was all completely within my capabilities as a Templar in training." "Right. Order up," Garrod called, juggling a vial of black liquid in one hand. "Who wants some liquid taint?" "Oh, I'll call dibs on that one," Davith said, pausing and pulling an arrow out of a darkspawn chest plate. He deftly caught the vial when it was tossed to him. Garrod knelt back down and started extracting more from one of the corpses, careful not to let the black ooze touch his fingers. He seemed the only one willing to risk touching the stuff. Finian noticed Mila swaying where she stood, but when she noticed him watching, she only gave him an intimidating glare and turned away. Hugo emerged out of the foliage and plodded up to the group, hacking and coughing. The darkspawn's black blood coated his muzzle. Percival immediately rushed to his hound's side and knelt, inspecting his dog's snout with drawn features. "Oh no." Felicity hurried over to stand next to the high-ever duo, peering down at the dog as well. "It looks like he swallowed darkspawn blood. Can he be healed?" Percival asked grimly. It was the first time he'd spoken in front of the other recruits. Finian saw many of them startle at the sound of the noble's cultured voice. Felicity, however, was all business. "Not unless he can be made a Grey Warden. However, there is a chance he might survive the taint. It works differently on animals than it does on people. If he survives it, he'll be immune to it, just like a Grey Warden. But, it's a painful process all the same." Felicity glanced over at Mila, who merely pursed her lips. "Actually," Garrot said, tossing a third vial of blood on the ground next to him, "wasn't the kennel master offering a reward for some flower out here, to help cure the sick dogs?" "Oh, right," Felicity cried. "White with a red center," he'd said. "I have seen such flowers," Mila said. "Though I do not approve of this enslaved wolf being forced to fight alongside us. He fights too bravely to allow him to come to harm." Hugo quirked his head at Mila, then let out a bark that quickly turned into a whine. "That's decided, then," Alistair said. "One more thing to do, on our jolly jaunt through the creepy swamp. Finian smiled at Alistair. At least we have all the darkspawn blood we need. And then some. Garrot stood, a pile of vials in his arms. I wonder if I could coat my weapons with this stuff. There's sure as the stone enough supply. Marnin's eyes narrowed at him. You would poison your weapons. Every advantage helps, princess. Stop calling me that. Finian sensed an old argument there, and sought to diffuse it before it came to blows. He wouldn't put it past either of them. Well, considering we're fighting the darkspawn, Garrot, I don't think tainting your weapons would really do much. For all we know, it might make them stronger. Imagine, you stab a hurlock, and the wound heals right back up as soon as you remove the dagger. Garrot cast him a suspicious eye, but then smirked. You make a good point, elf. Hugo hacked loudly, and everyone winced, Percy worst of all. A bit unnerving, isn't it? Ser Jory muttered. First the Dalish elf, then the dog. Any one of us could be next. Do not speak of me as if I am already lost, Shemlin. Even if any of us did catch the taint, Felicity said matter-of-factly, standing up, we will be taking our joining tonight. I assume, Alistair, that the ritual has something to do with taint immunity. The warden nodded. Meanwhile, Garrot passed by and pushed a vial into Finian's hands. The elf stored it in his pouch. In that case, even if we did get ill, the chances of dying that quickly of the taint are small. Rather, you'd merely be in awful pain for a couple hours. First, there would be an itchy sensation, like insects under the skin. Then, a burning sensation, followed by trembling and weakness. Now, if you were to decay to the point of the hallucinations, it may be problematic to partake in the ritual, as I understand the visions can be quite horrific, judging by all the screaming and thrashing victims exhibit. Please stop, Jory said weakly. Just, stop. Please. I think what the Lady Mage is trying to say, Sir Knight, Davith said with some amusement, is don't catch the taint. Easy as that, right? Hugo coughed again, as if to drive the point home that it was not, in fact, as easy as that. Come, Mila said. There should be a cluster of the flowers this way. She turned and started off through the woods. With a shrug at the others, Finian turned and followed after her. He heard the rest fall into step behind him. It took 10 minutes of winding through the swamp to find the indicated flower, during which time a pack of wolves thought Felicity would make a nice snack. A couple thwacks on the nose and a blast of lightning from the resident thundercloud made them think otherwise. Finally, they emerged from the trees into a relatively dry clearing, overlooking a tower that had long since sunken in the swamp. A fallen log sat at the edge of the mire, surrounded by a cluster of white flowers with red centers. There, see. Mila said, stowing her bow. She bent down to pluck one, then froze, her face going white. Finian wasn't the only one to rush forward. Alistair, who had been right behind him, got there first, catching the elf as she collapsed. Carefully, the warden lowered the Dalish elf to the ground, and Felicity pushed through the clustered recruits to kneel down next to her. Mila's face was tight with pain, her eyes glazed even as she stared stubbornly forward. Her mouth was pressed tightly shut, as if afraid she might scream if she opened it. Her hands, meanwhile, clutched at her bared midriff, nails curling to dig into her own skin. She's succumbing, Felicity said, yanking off her pack and digging through it. She pulled out a small clay pot and popped off the stopper. Oh, someone stop her from scratching herself. Finian did so, leaping forward to grab the other elf's hands as they started to draw trails of blood. I warned Duncan that this would happen, Marnin's voice said irritably from behind them. You warned him that the dog would get sick, Khazar said, so then we'd go looking for some magic flower to heal it, and then she'd keel over while picking it. That'd have been impressive, it would, Davith chuckled. Felicity spread the salve in the pot onto Mila's bare stomach, and the pain on the Dalish elf's face eased. She blinked, her eyes coming into focus. Abellis. I apologize, Mila gasped tightly. I seem to have fallen. This is just a temporary salve, Felicity said. It eases the pain, but not the symptoms. Mila, we must get you back to camp. The Dalish elf fought against Alistair's and Finian's grips, breaking away from them and pushing into a sitting position. Her hand, Finian noticed, clutched at her leather breastplate, just above her heart. The mission is not complete. Vir Asan, I must not waver. If you continue on, Marnan said flatly, you will not make it back at all. So be it. Mila attempted to stand, but her legs did not seem to want to hold her. Felicity reached out to support her. If that is to be my path, then I will walk it with pride. Once again, Finian was a little awed. Was this the strength of the Dalish he'd heard so much about? Had all elves been like this, once? Man, had the alienage elves fallen a long way, and Finn was no exception to that. All of us don't really need to look for the scrolls anyway, Finian said. That caught more than just Mila's attention. At their curious looks, he shrugged. We've got what we need for the ritual, right? Now, we just need to get those scrolls, which I seem to recall Duncan tasking to Alistair, not to all of us. Wow, thanks, said Junior Warden said dryly. I do so love being left alone in the Korkari wilds to die. Some of us would go with you, of course, Finian assured him. But, honestly, we'd probably pass through the woods easier if there were fewer of us. He turned back to the Dalish elf for confirmation. Right. That is, correct. Mila looked reluctant to admit it. She winced and brought a hand to her chest. And I suppose I would only slow you down. I'll come back with you, Felicity said to the elf leaning against her. I know a very talented healer in camp, if anyone can stave off the taint until the joining, it will be her. Hugo, Percival's voice said softly. You go with them as well. The dog's head was hanging low at this point, but he raised it to Percy and let out an anxious whine. I'll be fine. Just be a good boy and let the kennel master treat you. Percy turned a furrowed brow to Felicity. You will see him safely to the kennels, I hope. Of course. I will go back to camp as well, Ser Jory said, shifting uncomfortably. The women will need an escort, after all, in case of darkspawn attacks. Khazar snorted. That, and you're afraid of the forest. Ser Jory frowned at the mage. That's not fair, not all of us can shoot lightning out of our fingers. I'm just being realistic, here. They will need protection, and I am ready to be done with this particular test. There is nothing wrong with that. Well, I, for one, Marnan said, would like to continue on to fetch the treaties. I am quite curious as to what potential allies they concern. Same here, Davith said. You don't suppose the ancient Grey Wardens were lucky enough to treat with high dragons, do you? That'd be a nice twist, right there. Finian chuckled. What, summoning an army of high dragons to take out the darkspawn? Would be something to see, wouldn't it? Sure, right before they ate all of us whole. Good way to die, though, Alistair put in. Lots of people die from battle and disease, but how many ghosts can come back and say they were eaten by a dragon? We'd be the envy of all the ghosts, we would. All three laughed. Garrot snorted, staring at the three of them incredulously. This is going to be a long journey. We'd better be off, Felicity said. Mila winced as the mage helped her walk. The ruin you are looking for is southeast of here, the Dalish said, on a hill just past the sunken dome. It has many statues in front of it, so I hope that even you Shemlin would be able to identify it. Ah, Alistair sighed wistfully, the insults to our collective intelligence. I missed those. Mila just scowled at the blonde and allowed herself to be walked off. Ser Jory nodded and followed, attentively keeping an eye on the forest around them. With a last whimper and wag of his tail, Hugo trailed after them, though he kept pausing to look back at Percival, as if to check that his master was still all right. That left 7 of them, standing on the edge of the bog. So. Alistair started, looking around. Southeast is. Davith pointed, chuckling. Right. I knew that. Alistair started off, and Marnan fell into step beside him. Finian found himself walking in second rank, next to Garrot. The dwarf smirked up at him. Nice work, he rumbled, too softly for any of the others to hear. What do you mean? He asked casually, though he had a feeling he knew what this was about. The Dalish elf. changed her tune like a minstrel on a lute. I don't know whether to be impressed or disgusted. Finian swallowed. He didn't like being confronted about this, not by a stranger. For the second time, he said, I just want everyone to get along. If that's what you gotta tell yourself to help you sleep at night, go ahead. The dwarf's grin was dark, the shadows of the canopy playing across his face. But me? I know different. If you ever want to fess up and admit what a smarmy, silver-tongued little bastard you are, I'll be all ears. Finian didn't say anything else for a good long while. 24 Enter, the witch. By Khazar's reckoning, being recruited into the Grey Wardens was, by a far margin, the best thing that had ever happened to him. Khazar laughed as he felt an arrow fly past his ear. Turning, he sent a volley of thunderbolts out at the darkspawn archer who had dared to target him, the mage chortling in delight as the creature shrieked and blackened into a charred husk under the onslaught. It was freedom. It was power. It was, so amazingly wonderful to finally let loose, just the way he'd always wanted. The scent of burned flesh surrounded them, and it brought a satisfied smile to Khazar's face to know that he had put that smell there. This was what he was made for. This was what he was meant to do. He laughed again as he rained fire down upon the darkspawn alpha. Alistair stumbled back as he got caught in the blast, since he'd been engaging said alpha. Alistair turned to glare back at Khazar. Hey, watch it. Too hot for you, Templar. Khazar laughed gleefully, then swept out a hand and encased a stream of approaching darkspawn in ice. He then made a game out of blasting each to bits with lightning in the most spectacular way possible. He couldn't imagine how other people lived without magic. He certainly didn't know how he had, locked up in the Chantry's cage for so long. Let Knight Commander Grigor try to tranquil him now. Finally, much to Khazar's disappointment, the darkspawn attack ebbed. Finian killed the last genlock with a double stab to the back, and all that they were left with was the sound of frogs and their own heavy breathing. Alistair stomped over to Khazar. He looked furious, and his face was now red and blistered in patches, which only heightened Khazar's elation. What was that? You blasted me, you little creep. Khazar couldn't seem to stop grinning. No, I blasted the alpha. You just got in the way. He felt his grin morph into a smirk. What's the matter? Your Templar training can't stand up to a little bitty fireball. There was nothing little or bitty about that thing. What were you thinking, firing into melee? The others were gathering around the two of them. Remind me never to get on that elf's bad side, Khazar heard Davith whisper. It was a sentiment Khazar could appreciate. Marnan stepped between Alistair and Khazar, scowling her disapproval at both like an enchanter scolding unruly apprentices. It does not help us to fight amongst ourselves. Right, Alistair said, voice dripping with sarcasm, I'll just ignore the blatant attack against my person. That sounds like an excellent idea. Khazar laughed. I've told you before, Templar. If I wanted to hurt you, you'd already be a charred husk by now. Alistair paused, looking around at the corpses nearby. Nearly half of them had been dispatched by Khazar's spells, and showed it. You know, I'm starting to believe that. Khazar just smirked and pushed past the Templar. He could still feel the magic singing through his veins, and it made him want to dance with it. Alas, they were in the ruin's shadow, so it wasn't likely any more of the creatures were lurking about. More's the pity. Old ruins, Garrot said as the group started up the hill toward the archive. Always good for a little scavenging. The dwarf smirked and shifted the kit on his back. Khazar had seen a number of things disappear into that pack out here, but never anything of any apparent use. A bit of wood here, a leaf there. Either the dwarf suffered from some kind of strange compulsion, or he saw uses for random junk that others did not. You don't suppose we'll know the scrolls when we see them, do you? Davith asked. He had a fresh scratch across his face where a darkspawn had gotten him. Khazar was glad he hadn't taken any damage himself. Without the Amel woman here, annoying twit though she was, any wounds they collected had to make do with only a quick poultice application for healing. They'll bear the Grey Warden crest, I suppose, Alistair said. The Grey Warden crest? Finian said teasingly. In an old Grey Warden archive? Shouldn't be hard to spot then. I'm sure the scrolls will be the only Grey Warden items in the Grey Warden archive. Oh, good point. Alistair sighed. I suppose we're going to have to do a bit of digging around, then. And that's what they did. When they reached the ruin, they found it caved in and tumbled, rubble covering almost everything. Admittedly, earth had never been Khazar's strongest element, but between him magically breaking through the rocks and Garrot rigging up a pulley to clear the debris away, they managed to unearth a wall of what had once been shelves. Finian started digging through that while the rest of them continued clearing the debris. Finian worked down the lines of shelves. Occasionally, something would clink or clatter as he found an object of interest and tossed it on the growing pile, an old knife, a pot, a stamp, something that may have been a letter opener, but no scrolls, as of yet. Khazar blasted apart another rock, making the attached wall of rubble come tumbling down nearly on top of him. He jumped back, and looked up to see that the fall of rocks had revealed a staircase heading up behind it. Sitting on it, watching them, was a woman. Well, she said silkily. What have we here? Behind him, Khazar could hear weapons being drawn, and something that sounded like Finian hitting his head on something, complete with a soft yelp. Khazar didn't do much of anything, transfixed as she stood and made her way smoothly down the stairs. Khazar may have been a mage, but he was also a healthy, hot-blooded young man. And this woman was not wearing a shirt. Well, sure, that drapery thing she had may have been counted as a covering, technically, but there was far more skin than not. Are you vultures, I wonder? The woman continued, reaching the bottom of the steps. Scavengers, poking amidst a corpse whose bones were long since cleaned. Or merely intruders, come into these darkspawn-filled wilds of mine in search of easy prey. She rounded the curve of the rubble pile, turning to face them with arms crossed under her bosom. It was distracting. What say you? Scavengers or intruders? We are neither, Marnin's voice spoke up sternly. There was a low rumbling chuckle. Speak for yourself, princess. We're Grey Wardens, Finian said quickly, coming forward to stand in front, next to Khazar. He was rubbing his head. From what I understand, the Wardens once owned this tower, so we can't really scavenge or intrude. The Grey Wardens have long since left, said the woman. Invoke a name that means nothing here if you must, it means little to me. The woman started walking, moving around the group. Some might say prowling around them. I have watched your progress for some time. Where do they go, I wondered. Why are they here? And now you disturb ashes none have touched for so long. She stopped and stood at a window, so that the afternoon light touched her skin just so. Why is that? Nobody answer her, Alistair whispered. She looks chastened, and that means others may be nearby. The woman made an amused sound. You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you. Yes, swooping is bad. She's a witch of the wilds, she is, Davith said, looking more nervous now than he'd been when facing down Darkspawn. She'll turn us into toads. An apostate. Khazar said, now staring at the woman for a reason other than to appreciate her ample bare skin. Yes, she did have that certain carriage that defined a mage who was assured of their own power. Also, a staff. It was mostly the staff that gave it away. A witch of the wilds. The woman leaned against the stone and looked over them, obviously amused. Such idle fancies, those old legends. Notice she doesn't deny it, Garrot said with amusement. How have you escaped the tower for so long? Khazar found himself asking. He was fascinated by the discovery of her. This was a mage who was every bit as free of the chantry as he was. You must be powerful. Or very clever. How did you do it? She arched an eyebrow at him. Sense I'm more than casual curiosity in your questions? No matter. She raised her head to Percival, who stood in the back with sword still drawn. You there? You have not yet spoken. Have you a mind of your own? What are your thoughts? Percival's gaze was steady and heated, full of suspicion as he regarded her. Khazar was honestly surprised when the man actually answered. I think you're toying with us. The witch laughed. Toying with you, am I? Nay, but I am merely a curious local, come to investigate the home intrusion that you committed. She turned to Marnin, pushing off from the wall. You women do no frighten like little boys. Tell me your name, and I shall tell you mine. The dwarf's lips pinched, but she nonetheless nodded her head in greeting. I am Marnan. A pleasure to meet you. The witch paused in surprise. Now that is a proper civil greeting, even here in the wilds. She looked over all of them. You may call me Morgan. One by one, the party gave their names, though Alistair and Davith seemed reluctant to do so. Khazar would have laughed at their superstitions, if he hadn't been so rapt on watching the witch. Shall I guess your purpose? Morrigan continued when introductions were done. You sought something in this ruin? Something that is here no longer. Here no longer. Alistair advanced a couple steps, hand going to the pommel of his sword. You stole them, didn't you? You're some kind of sneaky witch thief. Smooth, Khazar deadpanned. How does one steal from dead men? The witch posited. Garrot chuckled. Quite easily, actually. Those documents are Grey Warden property, Alistair pressed, showing a bit of spine, for once. I suggest you return them. I will not, Morrigan said sharply, for 'twas not I who removed them. Then who did? Finian asked politely, as if they were having a discussion about the weather over tea. Morrigan balked a bit, apparently caught off guard. 'Twas my mother, in fact. So she's the daughter of a sneaky witch thief, Garrot said. Your mother? Finian asked. Can you take us to her? Morrigan studied Finian, and Khazar was surprised by how sharp her eyes could be. Like a bird's. Now there is a sensible request. I like you. I'd be careful, Alistair whispered. First it's I like you. Then zap. Frog time. Khazar cast an incredulous look back at the blonde. Who in the Fade taught you about magic, Templar? Because they obviously need to be fired. Mean that literally, do you? Alistair sneered back. Very well, Morrigan, Marnan said diplomatically. Lead on, and we will follow. If it pleases you. She turned and disappeared into the rushes, and the group slowly moved to follow after. Percival, Khazar noticed, had still not put his sword away. 25 a calling. All she knew was fire. It was a burning, all-consuming heat, roaring through her until her muscles spasmed with it. Mila felt trapped by it, hedged in by disorienting red and thrumming pain. At some point, she had fallen to the ground. Above her, she could see shapes moving and hear the sounds of battle. She knew she needed to get up, but the pain made it hard to focus. It was hard to see with everything so bright. She scrabbled for her bow, certain she had dropped it nearby. A genlock growled right above her, and she forewent looking for her bow to draw her hunting knife instead. She slashed wildly at the looming shape. Something cold and sharp slashed into her arm, and the knife dropped. Still, she refused to cry out, despite the stinging pain that flowered from the wound. Something else growled behind her, and a brown blur tackled the dark spawn, tearing into it despite its own wheezing breaths. The dog. Mila had not thought much of the creature at first, seeing in it the same twisted deformation of domestication that her own people had undergone at the hands of the Shemlin. It, too, had once been a noble creature, now doomed to serve the Shemlin because it knew nothing else. Except that this creature was still certainly noble, in its own way. It fought on, despite the pain of its illness, and made protecting its clanmate the human named Percival its top priority. In that, Mila saw something Dalish in the dog. Felicity, wear your flank. What? Eek. Got it. The two humans were running around above her, though Mila saw them as little more than blurs at this point. Her arm wound stinging, she felt around for her knife. The Maberry's heavy four-legged tread approached, and she saw the knife drop in front of her with a metallic glint of sunlight. Gratefully, she retrieved it. Thank you, brave creature, she managed hoarsely. The dog barked, then coughed. The sounds of battle had wound down, it seemed the humans had proved victorious. Felicity's dark form appeared in front of Mila. You're bleeding. It is a flesh wound. Exactly. That means your flesh has been wounded. May I? Mila sighed and held out her arm, knowing she couldn't afford to be any more of a detriment than she currently was. The human grasped her arm, and healing magic flowed into her, knitting it up. My bow. I think I dropped it. Mila, it's on your back. Oh. She frowned. Her head felt muzzy, and a fresh wave of hot pain sliced through her, flowering out from her stomach in a pulse of agony. She hissed, but did not cry out. Crying out was weakness. Come on. We're almost there. Ostagar is in sight. I cannot tell, she gasped between gritted teeth. Visions of dark shadows and red-hot rivers swam before her eyes. It is far, too dark. Jari. Here, my lady. I'll get her. The knight's large form knelt over Mila, and she felt herself be lifted and borne like a child. In the wake of the pain, she was too weak to do much but struggle feebly. Hurry. There was a bouncing sensation and a sense of movement, but those were just distractions when compared to the seething darkness that seemed to creep in on the edge of her awareness. That darkness had voices, thousands of them. They were there, watching her. Hissing and laughing. One of them had Tamlin's face. Vir Sulan Nen, she chanted as the world faded around her, trying her best to keep the shadows at bay. Vir Dirt Hera, Vir Simula Dash, she gasped as another spike of heat swam through her. Somewhere, the dog whimpered. Vir Simula Numan, Vir Lath, Savunin. Voices broke into her awareness, one of many now, all of them dark and twisted, beckoning for her. Come to us. Join us, little Lethalin. Win. Felicity? What's the matter? You are weary, Delenn. Come and rest. Submit to the dreams and join us. Oh dear. Yes, I see what you mean. Lay her here. Can you do anything? We will see. Come to your new home. Your new kin need you, Lethalin. Vir Asan. Vir Borasan. Vir Udalin. I will not submit. And then all was blackness. 26 Desire and Rage. So, does anyone else here doubt that that was really Flemeth, or is it just me? Percival looked up at the sound of Alistair's whisper. So far, the journey back toward Ostagar had been quiet. Everyone, it seemed, was deep in thought. Since I have no sodding idea what a Flemeth is. Garrot said with a snort. I'm gonna go with who cares. Well, I suppose you wouldn't know, Davith said. He'd been uncharacteristically twitchy, ever since this Morrigan showed up. Percival didn't blame the thief, he didn't trust her either. Me, I was born in a small village not too far east from here. Grew up hearing tales about the witches of the wilds. They'll drag children off in their sleep, they will. And what, pray tell, would I do with children, I ask. Their guide called from up ahead, letting them know that, despite the distance they were keeping from her, she could still hear them. Eat them, probably, Alistair grumbled. Again, Percival agreed. The moment the witch had appeared, alarm bells had tolled in his head. Something about her was just evil. He couldn't place it. Perhaps it was the way her eyes watched them predatorily, probing for weaknesses. Perhaps it was the silky, yet challenging way she spoke. Perhaps it was just the fact that she was an apostate and a barbarian, and therefore could not be counted on to follow the strictures of society. Like common decency, for one. That was perhaps what frightened him most, about this woman, not her manner or her magic. Not the fact that she may or may not have been the daughter of a 1,000-year-old sorceress. No, she was a woman, and a damn sexy one. And she knew it. Her ensemble was crafted painstakingly to elicit promises of excitement and mystery. Percival's experienced eye knew that upon first sight. And worse, it worked. Percival felt himself, stirred by it, mind roaming unbidden as he pictured himself running his hands over that wind-roughened skin and through that tangled hair. That was what alarmed him most of all about her. She awoke things in him that should have been dead. But life went on even after tragedy, and his body still remembered fondly the whisper of sheets. If she realized and acted upon it, he couldn't say that he could control himself. No, losing control was not an option anymore. Akausland did his duty first, that's what his father had said as he lay dying. For his father, Percival would do his duty. And that duty was to not bed wilderness witches who had stolen Grey Warden treaties. No matter how much he may have wanted to. All this rage and desire was filling up that emptiness inside him. He had a hard time letting it go, when at least it made him feel things again. And here we are, Morrigan said, stopping at a ridge. As they pulled up beside her, they saw Ostagar's walls before them. "'Tis reasonable to assume you can take it from here, I think. Do come back soon." Despite the silky sarcasm in her voice, Finian's response of, "Thank you, Morrigan," sounded entirely sincere. Marnan sighed and started down the ridge, heading toward the ruin. Percival took up the rear. He fought not to let his eyes linger on artfully revealed skin as he passed the witch, but he could tell by the quirk of her lips that she was all too aware of his internal struggle. A desire demon given flesh, she was. Once they were out of earshot of the apostate, Alistair immediately got to mocking. "Thank you, Morrigan, for stealing our scrolls and then not turning us into toads on the way back. So kind of you, really. Androstes knickers, Finian, do you have to be nice to everyone?" Said Elf shrugged. She wasn't that bad. A bit cold, but we were strangers, heavily armed and outnumbering her. She was scared. Scared. Alistair snorted incredulously. "Somehow, I don't think that was it." "I agree with Alistair," Davith said. "They're witches, right? Maybe we should check the scrolls over for hexes, or something." Khazar threw his hands in the air. "For the last time, magic doesn't work like that. By the Fade, I wish that Amel Twit were here, just so she could explain it to you. Obviously, there are other kinds of magic than what you encountered in your tower," Marnan said reasonably. "Myself, I'm not sure what to think of either woman." They did return the scrolls. Without asking anything in return, at that. "Good point," Garrot chuckled. "She did hex the things, then. They obviously recognize the Darkspawn threat," Finian reasoned. "Think about it, if Flemeth is as old as they say, she's had to have lived through several blights, right? So she, out of anyone, would know the danger. Or maybe it's all a trick," Alistair argued shrewdly, "to lure us into a false sense of security. If the trick is to put us at ease," Finian bandied back, "then it's obviously not working, is it?" That made Alistair pause. "Well, maybe they're not very good at it." "No," Percival said softly, though he could tell everyone's attention swiveled to him every time he spoke. It made him inwardly wince. "Still, they're manipulators. Or at least, Morrigan is. Whatever their motivation, they're getting something out of this." "I agree with Sir Smiles back there," Garrot said. "They both stank of craftiness to me, and not just in a witchcrafty way." "It's a moot point now," Marnan said. "It's over and done with. Let's just get these treaties back to Duncan." They walked the rest of the way back to Ostagar in silence, passing through the gate into camp with a collective sigh of relief. Alistair went off to report to Duncan, while the rest were left to their own devices until nightfall, still an hour or so away. "So where do you suppose Felicity took Mila?" Finian asked. "Who cares?" Khazar scoffed, and abruptly turned and stomped off. Garrot made a pointing motion and slipped off into the shadows, presumably to keep an eye on the young mage. "She knows a healer in the mage's camp," Marnan said. "She will likely be tending to her there." "Ah." Finian then glanced up at Percival. "You want to check on Hugo first?" Percy unclenched a fist he hadn't realized he'd been clenching. Shortly, he nodded, and the four recruits set off toward the sounds of dogs barking. Ser Jory was there, looking out over the dogs. He turned and smiled at them as they approached. "Ah, good. You're back. I trust everything went well." "Yep," Finn said. "We got the treaties, all ready to be rubbed in people's faces." "Excellent." Marnan asked, "How are Mila and Hugo?" Ser Jory nodded to one of the pens. "Hugo's doing much better." Sure enough, when Percy drew even with the indicated pen, his hound looked up at him and gave a wag of his tail. "The kennel master fixed him up with a paste from that flower. Says he'll most likely make it through, and be fine in a couple days." Percival sighed, feeling something close to a smile reach his face. A burden he hadn't been aware of lifted from his shoulders. His last connection to his past was here, safe. As Percy watched, Hugo laid his head back down on his paws and went to sleep. Mila, though. She collapsed on the way back to camp. All four of them turned to Jory. Marnan sighed, I knew we should not have let her come. Is she all right? Finian asked. Jory shrugged. I can't rightfully say. When I left them, Felicity and the elder mage were working on her, but they shooed me out of the tent before they'd made any progress. Last I saw, she was spasming and kicking around, and looked to be holding back a scream. Poor elf, Davith whispered. Will she last until the joining? Marnan asked. Again, Jory just shrugged. Perhaps it is best we do it sooner, then, said the dwarf, rather than later. I think I'll go peek in on her, Finian said, and flitted off. Marnan turned to Davith. You go retrieve the duster and the mage. I'm going to help Duncan get the ritual started. Agreed. I'm about ready to have this done, I am. Both also departed, heading for opposite corners of the camp. This left Percival and Ser Jory alone. Percy spent the silence just watching his dog breathe. One less casualty to mourn. So. Ser Jory began. I've been wondering. Percy looked up at the knight expectantly. You carry the High Ever crest on your shield. I'd moved up there recently, you know, to start a family with my wonderful wife. Percival turned his eyes back to the kennel, not liking the direction of this conversation. Well. I'm just wondering, really. Your name is Percival, right? And theirs. Well, since his swordplay is rather legendary in the tourneys up there, and yours seems fit to match that description dash. Yes, Percy cut in, a bit sharper than he'd intended. I'm Percival Cowsland. Oh. Sorry, my lord. I did not intend to pry. Percival turned that over for a moment, then sighed. I know, Ser Jory. It's just a painful connection for me, right now. Oh? And why would that be? As I understand it, the Cowslands are considered one of the most. Were considered, Ser Jory. His grip on the kennel fence tightened at that dagger in his heart, though it was perhaps not as sharp as it had been before. Now, I'm all that's left. Oh. Ser Jory was silent for a moment. I'm sorry. And he sounded sincere, damn him. That left Percy with only that burning rage, circling low in the otherwise empty pit of his soul, and nowhere to let it loose. If he kept going like this, it would soon consume him. And part of him was beginning to wonder why he didn't simply let it. 27 The joining. The circle of gathered recruits was soundless. Despite what they had just seen, no one had the courage to break the sacred silence of the ritual. Mila was already unconscious on the ground, having been the first to be submitted. Davith, the next, had not been so lucky. He would precede his fellow recruits into oblivion. Ser Jory, after him, had panicked and drawn his sword, and Duncan had illustrated under no uncertain terms that, in this, there was no turning back. That left 6 pairs of shocked eyes, one slightly less shocked pair, and one that was merely saddened and world-weary. You have been called to submit yourself to the taint. Duncan's voice broke the silence, and the cup passed hands again. One by one, 6 more drank darkspawn blood. One by one, they each fell back, fading into dreams of a fearsome black dragon. 28 Matters of honor and glory. Marnan awoke feeling much as she usually did after spending a night carousing with the warriors, an ache in her head, a foul taste in her mouth, and some new bruises that indicated she'd probably fallen flat on her face at one point. She opened her eyes and sat up. Above her stretched the night sky, still so dazzlingly strange to the dwarf. Around her were the twilit ruins of Ostagar, sprinkled with the prone bodies of her new comrades. Well, most of them were prone, anyway. Percival's pale figure knelt beside Davith's body, and Alistair crouched over him with a hand on his shoulder. They were speaking quietly, though Marnan could not make out what was being said. Perhaps some kind of benediction or prayer. Duncan moved around the ruin, checking on the rest of them for signs of life. Some of the others were stirring. Finian was mumbling fretfully like a child caught in a nightmare, and the castless groaned and rolled over as Marnan watched. The mages were both still out cold, and she couldn't tell the Dalish elf's state from here. "Ah, good, you're awake," Duncan said, reaching down to help Marnan to her feet. "How do you feel?" "A bit like I just spent a night sampling something a fair bit stronger than moss wine." Duncan chuckled, the relief of having the ritual done evident on his face. "I dare say I can't imagine one of your background getting quite so drunk." Marnan smiled, feeling some of that relief herself. "You have obviously never been a dwarven warrior." Then, it hit her. The joining was over, she was a Grey Warden now. A Grey Warden. One of the most honorable vocations that any being, be they human, dwarf, elf, or nug, could take on. She looked at her hands, as if they might have somehow transformed to reflect the change. She didn't feel particularly different, really, but she knew she was. Whatever they had drunk darkspawn blood included had made them darkspawn killers to the core. They had been stuffed in the forge and shaped, and now it was only a matter of time until it could be discovered what sort of weapons they might become. "Sodding stone," the duster's voice groaned. "Who let a nug burrow into my head?" Marnan scowled, recalling that the castless wretch was also a Grey Warden now. A blatant criminal, being afforded such an honor, oh well. As he'd pointed out often enough, they were equals now. She just had to tolerate him, and try to fight as far away from him as possible. Duncan crossed the ruin to help Braska to his feet, and Marnan wandered over to where the other two humans were kneeling. Only as she got closer did she realize that what was being said was no benediction. "All die, Alistair. Every last one. Finian will be next, just you wait, or Duncan. And then the rest of you." Marnan shivered, because the human's voice was as empty as it was soft. "Easy, Percival," Alistair whispered soothingly. "You're just a bit upset. You don't know." Percival shook his head, and, when Marnan could properly see his face, she saw that his eyes were as cold and lost as his voice. "You can't know how everyone, all of them. Death is a necessary consequence in war," Marnan said, and those deadened eyes turned up to her. Percival blinked, and suddenly his face contorted with anger so intense that Marnan was taken aback. "Don't speak to me of necessary consequence." He stood abruptly, pulling away from Alistair's comforting hand. "You may know war, dwarf, but I have a more than passing acquaintance with murder. Death is never necessary, and I sure as the void am not going to just sit and accept it." With a spin of his heel, the blond man stalked off into the night. "Oh dear," Finian's voice said softly from nearby. He looked wryly at Marnan in the firelight, still lying on the ground. "That's the sort of thing I was hoping to prevent." "You'd better go after him or something," Alistair sighed. "I will, in a minute, when I can sit up without retching." Finian paused, taking a deep breath. "All I can say is I've had like an ale that sat better than this." "Is that some sort of dig at the spirits of my people?" Marnan asked. "No, it's a dig at like an ale." Marnan considered that, then shrugged. "Fair enough. And for what it's worth, I'd agree." Felicity's prone form let out a groan then, reaching a hand up to rub her face. "I'm glad most of you made it," Alistair said, standing up. "At my joining there was one death. It was horrible. I can't believe you stabbed him." Felicity's voice cried, and she sat up. Duncan's response was gentle, but firm. It was necessary. Ser Jory knew that there would be no turning back once the ritual had begun. "But, you stabbed him." "What?" Braska scoffed. "You'd rather have the whole Grey Wardens are taint twisted, and that's why they're so good at killing darkspawn secret come out." Ser Jory probably wouldn't have told. "When he went for his blade," said Duncan, "he left me no choice." "I'm sorry." Khazar started thrashing around. When sparks started dancing from his hands in his sleep, everyone stood up in alarm. "Someone slap him awake, or something," Alistair suggested. "Hopefully before he kills us all in his sleep." "On it," the duster said. He leaned over the elf and smirked, and Marnan turned away, because she really didn't want to know what devious way the criminal was going to wake the mage. Instead, Marnan walked over to where Mila still lay, senseless. "She'll probably take a bit longer to recover than the rest of us," Felicity's voice said, and the healer appeared beside her. After all, she did not have many energy reserves before the ritual, because of her sickness. But she will recover. Almost assuredly. Felicity cast Marnan a smile. She survived the taint for that long, after all. I don't see why a bit of darkspawn blood now should give her any trouble. Behind them, Khazar awoke loudly with a sputter and a crack of lightning. A moment later, Garrot burst out laughing. Marnan rolled her eyes. Everyone, it is finished, Duncan said. Welcome to the Grey Wardens. I feel special already, Broska chuckled. What was with those dreams? Khazar sat up, rubbing his head. I've had less disturbing dreams when literally fighting a demon in the Fade. Khazar. Felicity hissed, for some reason. He made a face over at her. Such dreams come when you begin to sense the dark spawn, Duncan explained. As we all do. That, and many other things, can be explained in the months to come. Before I forget, there is one last part to the joining. Alistair moved to the table where they had first put the cup. Now, there was a stack of something glittery and metallic. Alistair held up a piece of the pile to reveal a black pendant on a silver chain. We take some of the blood and put it in a pendant. Something to remind us, of those who didn't make it this far. There was a moment of silence while he passed the pendants out, while everyone reflected on the deaths of Davith and Jory. Take some time, all of you, and rest up, Duncan said softly. Tomorrow will be a long day for all of us. There were nods all around, and several of the new wardens started off. Felicity drafted Alistair into carrying Mila back to camp, and Finian took the last pendant, to deliver to Percival. Marnan, Duncan's voice said, before the dwarf could head off to a much-needed bedroll. She turned expectantly. If you are up to it, I'd like you to accompany me to a meeting with the king. What makes her so special? Khazar could be heard muttering, but then the mage had disappeared into the darkness. Of course, Duncan. I'd be honored. He nodded, and motioned for her to follow him. She fell in step behind him and to the side, as she would have any commanding officer back home. And that's what he was, now that she was a full-fledged warden. They wound their way down a slope, and a candlelit table appeared in the darkness, surrounded by a cluster of figures. Loghain, my decision is final, a golden figure was saying as they approached. He was wearing what was obviously largely ceremonial armor. He must be the human king, then. I will stand by the Grey Wardens in this assault. You risk too much, Kaelin, argued a darker man in darker armor. As Duncan and Marnan rounded the table to take the free place on its other side, Marnan could see that there were heavy bags under his eyes. The Darkspawn Horde is too dangerous for you to be playing hero on the front lines. If that's the case, perhaps we should wait for the Orlshian forces to join us, after all. The darker man, Loghain, stiffened. I must repeat my protest to your fool notion that we need the Orlshians to defend ourselves. Ah, politics. How Marnan had missed being stuck in the middle of it. The pair argued a bit more about the current state of the forces, and Marnan deduced that this Loghain was some sort of general or tactician, and likely far more experienced than the much younger king. Then, once the king had made his point rather succinctly, he turned to the wardens. Duncan, are your men ready for battle? They are, your majesty. And this is one of your new recruits? I understand congratulations are in order. Marnan bowed. Thank you, your majesty. Your fascination with glory and legends will be your undoing, Kaelin, Loghain sneered. We must attend to reality. Fine, the king snapped. Speak your strategy. He unfurled a map onto the table in front of him. The Grey Wardens and I draw the Darkspawn into charging our lines. And then? You will alert the tower to light the beacon, Loghain said, pointing to a spot on the map. Signaling my men to charge from cover. A flank. Marnan was intrigued, remembering the battle down in the deep roads that had so efficiently routed them after such a maneuver. To flank the Darkspawn, I remember, the king said with impatience. This is the Tower of Ishal in the ruins, yes? Who shall light this beacon? I have a few men stationed there. It's not a dangerous task, but it is vital. Then we should send our best. Marnan could already see the tactician's displeasure at what was to come next. Send Alistair and some of the new Grey Wardens to make sure it is done. The king smiled at her. Marnan stiffened. I cannot speak for the others, but I would personally prefer to fight in the battle, Your Majesty. Of course, we need not have all of you climb the tower. The rest of you may join in the battle with me. Marnan thought over that, looking at the map. It illustrated a line of the king's main forces, front and center across the gorge. Off to the side, hidden in the wilds, were the forces that she assumed to belong to this Loghain man. May I offer a suggestion, Your Majesty? King Cailan smiled. Of course. I'd be happy to hear anything a Grey Warden brings to the table. Take the flank. She pointed to the marker for Loghain's men, and then crossed the gorge to its mirror position on the other side. And change it into a pincer. We'd have a much better chance of catching the lieutenants and emissaries near the back if we come at them from both sides. That will not be necessary. Loghain began. The king interrupted, I think it's an excellent idea. Duncan cast a curious eye down at her. You are thinking of placing the rest of the new wardens there? Just the handful of you. Marnan faced her commander's doubt with confidence. Khazar Sirana alone could absolutely decimate the horde, but he won't get a clear shot if he's stuck behind a line of knights and Mulberry hounds. Put him behind the enemy, with the advantage of surprise, and then clip his leash. I am certain that will make the difference. The smile the king flashed her was brilliant as the sun. You must have quite a bit of experience under your belt. I assume you will be leading them. Marnan bowed her head respectfully. If that is your Majesty's wish. It's settled then. My forces will draw the charge. Then, when the beacon is lit, the forces of Loghain and, oh, how daft of me. I'm afraid I never caught your name. Marnan, Your Majesty. The king blinked, and then smiled in a way that told her he very much recognized it. Stone met, Marnan. Loghain's and Marnan's forces will leave hiding when the beacon is lit and charge the back of the horde. You rely on these Grey Wardens too much. Loghain protested, glaring at Marnan. Is that truly wise? Enough of you conspiracy theories, Loghain, the king said with exasperation. Your Majesty, Duncan broke in. You should consider the possibility of the archdemon appearing. There are no signs of any dragons in the wilds, Loghain protested. Marnan was beginning to grow rather annoyed with this man. A little tactical caution, she could understand, but he obviously flat out distrusted the Grey Wardens. Isn't that what your men are here for, Duncan? The king said. Aye. Duncan looked like he wanted to protest, then settled on, yes, Your Majesty. At this point, a new voice broke in, and Marnan recalled that there were more than the four of them at the table. Your Majesty, the tower and its beacon are unnecessary, said a gaunt, bald man wearing mage robes. The circle of magi. We will not trust any lives to your spells, mage. Snapped another voice, this one belonging to an elderly woman in red and gold robes. Marnan understood that meant she was from the human chantry. Marnan was rather glad she hadn't specifically mentioned that Khazar Sirana, the linchpin of her arm of the attack, was a mage. Enough. Loghain cut in, taking command with the ease of experience. This plan will suffice. Reluctance filled his tone as he relented. The Grey Wardens will light the beacon and create a third arm behind the horde. Thank you, Loghain, said King Cailan. I cannot wait for that glorious moment. The Grey Wardens battling beside the King of Ferelden to stem the tide of evil. Loghain, for his part, was already walking away. He paused to look over his shoulder. Yes, Cailan. A glorious moment for us all. Marnan shuddered. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something in Loghain's tone reminded her of Belen. 29 the night before. We're not fighting in the battle. No, Templar. You're not fighting in the battle. I, on the other hand, am necessary for it. Khazar's teeth glinted in the firelight at his smug grin. Garrot fingered the heavy pendant around his neck, still startled by its weight. It kept banging against his chest. He supposed it would take time to get used to its presence. Still, he was reluctant to take it off. Not because of any sentimentality, of course, but because Duncan might stab him if he did. Though the look on the knight's face had been priceless. Best. Cult ritual. Ever. The new wardens had once again been collected from the four corners of camp, and were now gathered in front of the brazier. Apparently, the news Duncan and the princess brought was too urgent to wait until morning. What news? Why, half of them would be sent up a tower to turn on a glorified lamp, while the other half would play heroes down on the ground. Easy bet where the princess had put Garrot in her little scheme. The task of our force will be to engage the enemy from afar, Marnan said, ignoring Alistair's complaints and Khazar's smugness, so as to give Khazar the longest possible window to sling his spells. For that reason, I would like Mila and Felicity with us. Mila nodded from where she was sitting on one of the benches. She was still recovering and weak, but that didn't mean she wasn't back to her old stone bitch ways. I will atone for my failings this afternoon. Marnan smiled at her. I'm counting on it. But what of me? Felicity said nervously. Certainly, you can't think that I would be particularly effective. Honestly, I need you there primarily to heal. If Khazar and Mila are creating an obvious threat of themselves, they're going to attract attention and take some fire. Your job will be to keep them on their feet. Felicity nodded in understanding, but still bit her lip. What about you, princess? Garrot asked with a smirk, startling those nearby when he spoke. Heh. You going to pick them off from afar with the heat of your glares? My job is defense. Any darkspawn that comes too close will taste my axe. Leaving the rest of us to climb the tower. Convenient. You are welcome to come along, Brand. Garrot gave the princess one of his sharpest smirks. I wouldn't follow you into safety if the cavern was coming down on my head, much less follow you into a fight. Her eyes narrowed all disapprovingly, but she didn't rise to the bait. More's the pity. I can't believe I won't be in the battle. Alistair cried, throwing his hands in the air. Hey, we have an important job, Finian said, nudging the blonde man. Without the beacon, the plan doesn't work. Oh, strategy. Exciting. The princess turned a wry smile to him. The king felt much the same, actually. Alistair slumped. Oh, great. Now I'm being compared to him, am I? This day can't get any worse. Finian looked baffled, but nonetheless reached up to pat him on the shoulder. This is by the king's personal request, Alistair, said Duncan. He needs 4 Grey Wardens standing up there holding the torch. Just in case. This is not your choice. If King Kalen wishes the Grey Wardens to ensure the beacon is lit, then Grey Wardens will be there. I get it, I get it. Alistair paused, the corner of his lip curling up. But just so you know, if the king ever asks me to put on a dress and dance the Remy Gold, I'm drawing the line, darkspawn, or no. Way to take a stand, Blondie, Garrot chuckled. I don't know, Finian said with a smirk. That could be a great distraction. If we're lucky, Khazar said, maybe they'd go blind. Or at least we could cut them up when they all keel over laughing, Alistair concluded. Duncan looked over the gathered wardens, a low sigh escaping through his nose. Garrot wasn't the only one to laugh. 30 climbing the tower. The sounds of pitched battle waged somewhere outside, fierce and frightening, but inside, there was a much different conflict unfolding. Would you two stop looting things? It's making me uncomfortable. Then don't look, Garrot grunted while he jimmied the lock off an old chest. Finian, meanwhile, had climbed halfway up a wall to take a peek at an urn in an alcove. Yep, these settings were definitely ruby. His fingers twitched just looking at it. Relax, Alistair. Duncan said we had about an hour. It doesn't take that long to climb 3 sets of stairs. Percival stood a silent and stolid watch in the doorway of the chamber they were currently ransacking, on the 2nd floor of the Tower of Ishal. He watched them impassively, that cold, empty look back in his eyes. It made Finian worry. Well, at least the noble wasn't sinking into himself, like he had on the road out of Denerim. And like he'd been after the joining. Once he'd been able to stand up and keep his dinner down, Finn had found the noble just sitting by the kennels, staring off at nothing. Nothing Finian did had been able to rouse him, so he'd slipped Percival's amulet into his pocket and sat with him in silence well into the morning. Garrot. Finn called. Catch. Deftly, the dwarf turned and caught the urn when it was tossed to him, and Finian had his hands free to slide back down the wall. "Nice find, elf. These rubies have a good cut." "I know, right?" Finn grinned. He and Garrot may not have entirely trusted one another, but if there was one thing they could commiserate on, it was their mutual fondness for finding nice stuff. "I can't decide whether to break the urn and just take the jewels, or try to find room for the entire urn in my bag. If you think it's worth something, go for it. It's your find." Garrot tossed it back with a shrug. Finn caught it and stowed it in his pack. If he needed the room, he'd just break it later. Alistair had his hands over his eyes. "Whatever happened to, we have an important job, Alistair. That's what I want to know. Don't you know?" The dwarf chuckled. "The elf's a wily little puppet master. Would have said whatever you wanted to hear, just to get a chance at the tower." "Oh, sure," Finn crowed while digging through a bookshelf next to a window. "And your so-called refusal to fight under Marnin's command had nothing to do with possible scavenging. What can I say?" Garrot's smirk was toothy. "I'm an opportunist." "Don't let me disturb you too, then," Alistair groaned. "I'll just be over here. Not lighting a beacon. Don't mind me." While digging through the bookcase, Finian saw something down below the window, the shadows shifting in rain-soaked courtyard beneath it. He peered out, leaning over the sill, feeling the spray of rain against his face. "Oh no!" Alistair whispered. "Percival, get back." An arrow whisked past Finian's ear at the same time he heard a crash behind him. He jerked away from the window as a volley of arrows followed the first through it, flying past his face close enough to feel the wind of their passage. The elf ducked out of sight behind the bookcase. When he turned, he saw Percival in the doorway, his shield blocking a stream of darkspawn who were trying to enter. As Finn watched, the noble's sword lopped off the head of one Hurlock, but another only crowded into its place. The weight was slowly pushing the noble back into the room. "What the sodding stone are darkspawn doing past the front lines?" Garrot growled. Finian twisted his wrists, popping his daggers out of his wrist sheaths. He cast the dwarf a grin. "I assume they wanted to get in on the looting." Garrot snorted, unhooking his dagger and hand axe from his belt. "Too bad we got here first, eh?" And with that, the two of them dove in. Percival and Alistair created an impenetrable wall around the doorway, their swords flashing while their shields steadily pushed back against the encroaching pack. Finian honestly saw no way around the pair, until he noticed Percival being backed up into a table. Finian nimbly hopped up onto the table, then, grinning, used it to jump straight over the shield wall. He landed ungracefully on top of a genlock, but slit its throat before it had a chance to complain about being used as a landing pad. Sporting a few new bruises, the elf spun away from a sword that came at him, and swiped at the neck of one of Alistair's Hurlocks. A hand axe to the throat presently took down the darkspawn that had attacked Finian anyway, though he was hard-pressed to spot the dwarf in the crush. And then, it was over, the small wave of darkspawn dead at their feet. All four wardens took a moment to catch their breath, carefully wiping the blood off their respective weapons before stowing them. "So much for this being the safe job," Garrot grumbled. "There are darkspawn ahead of the line," Alistair panted. "It's official, we have to get to the beacon. Now." "Agreed." "Looting just got a lot less tempting," Finian said, putting on his best "oops, my mistake" smile. Alistair just made a face at him. The four of them hurried out into the hall. They could now hear the sounds of darkspawn throughout the tower around them, growls from down the hallway, and the scrabbling and clanging of feet on the floors above them. And something heavy slamming around above that, the tower echoing with the thunderous sound. They found the stairs up to the third floor, Alistair taking the steps two at a time. As they continued on, Finian noticed Garrot stopping at the upper landing. The elf turned and saw the dwarf digging through his scavenging sack. "What are you doing?" he hissed, hearing the sputtering sounds of darkspawn coming from below them. The darkspawn were heading for the same staircase the wardens had just climbed. Garrot flashed a toothy grin, deftly tying a rope across the staircase doorway. "Giving them a reason not to follow us." Something blade lay at his feet. The sounds were coming closer. "Go on. I'll catch up." "But..." A gaunt-legged hand pulled Finian away from the landing, and the elf reluctantly stumbled after Alistair as they continued running through the curved halls. Percival was in front now, and he skidded to a stop abruptly around a corner, then ducked behind his shield as a volley of arrows shot into it. The room beyond was seething with a good 24 darkspawn, and they'd all seen the trio come in. Alistair ran past Percival, bowling through a line of archers like an angry midwife through anything, really. Finian followed behind him, leaping on those darkspawn that were unlucky enough to fall down. It was his job to make sure they never got up again. Over the clashing of steel, Finian could hear the sounds of dogs barking. He saw Percival go rushing by into the next room, but he was too preoccupied with ducking the great sword that tried to shorten him by 6 inches to think about it much. Then, Percival reappeared, a dark smirk on his face like a herald of death, and with no less than 4 huge mulberry hounds behind him. "Avenge your masters," the noble growled, and the dogs leaped into the fray, tearing and biting at tainted flesh with relish. Finian felt a glancing blow from a mace sting his side, and he dropped to the ground and rolled under a weapon rack to escape his attacker. A moment later, a concussion rocked the floor, and said attacker had been sideswiped by a ballista bolt, and was now pinned to the wall by a 2-foot-long wooden shaft through its shoulder. Garrot smirked at him, standing on a ballista that had been pushed against one wall. "Didn't miss all the fun, did I?" "I think it's arguable that you are the fun," Finian panted, getting to his feet and running up behind one of the hurlocks flanking Alistair. "Sodding right," he heard Garrot mumble, followed shortly by the concussion of another ballista shot. Finian took out the hurlock, attacking Alistair with a swift double jab into its side. Then, he twisted around to hamstring a genlock that was clawing at the flank of one of the hounds. Said hound promptly jumped on said genlock and ate its face. Percival was nearby, fighting off a hurlock and a genlock near the exit into the next room, keeping his back to the wall so they couldn't flank him. Finian dove in and jammed both daggers into the hurlock's sides, and, while it roared in pain, Percival took the chance to thrust his sword through its chest. The genlock then tried to climb Percival's shield, actually latching onto the thing. However, a swift, brutal motion from Percival slammed the monster into the wall. It dropped off the shield and slumped, leaving a trail of blackened blood on the wall as it fell. A mulberry howled nearby, and Finian turned to see that the skirmish was over, and none of them seemed the worse for it. Finn had a couple new slices he couldn't quite explain, but all 4 wardens looked around with clear eyes and intact limbs, which was more than could be said about any of the bodies on the floor. Especially as the mulberry hounds continued to tear at them. "That," Alistair panted, wiping his brow with one bloodied gauntlet, "was insane." Garrot glanced back. "More coming." Now that it had been pointed out, Finian heard growls from the stairwell behind them, though the growls were interrupted by a metallic swooping sound. "What did you?" Finian began. Garrot just winked. "They're everywhere," Alistair said. "I can feel more up ahead. I don't think we can take much more." "Someone better make a call," Garrot growled. "My traps won't hold them for long." "There are side rooms off the next chamber," Percival said, then turned and ran through the door without waiting for a response. They followed after him, turning into a side room off the corridor just as they heard another wave of darkspawn clatter up the stairs behind them. As soon as Alistair had lumbered into the room, Percival and Garrot slammed the door shut behind them. All of them stayed still, holding their breath as they heard a veritable horde of darkspawn pass by the other side of the flimsy wooden door. Someone gulped. They had ended up in a barracks. Bunks lined the walls, interspersed with trunks and various personal knickknacks. Out of habit, Finn snagged a scrimshaw necklace off a nightstand and slipped it into his pocket. Then, he winced, because he hadn't really meant to do that at a time like this. Finally, the sounds of growling and shuffling outside their door faded with distance, and everyone breathed again. "We're never going to make it to the staircase at this rate," Alistair groaned quietly. "How are we supposed to get past a small army of darkspawn with just the 4 of us?" There was a window in the room, open and unshuttered to the spring rain. Finian leaned out of it, seeing the courtyard below seethe with pockets of darkspawn. From up above, he could hear something thundering around, closer now than it had been before. Like something gigantic was walking around up on the roof. Finian poked his head further out the window, trying to see what the thing making the noise was. Then, he noticed the jaggedness of the stones of the tower's facade. "How well can you climb, elf?" a low voice asked right next to his ear, and Finian jumped, realizing Garrot was leaning out the window next to him, also looking up at the stones. Finn pondered that. There had been a certain palace district estate back in Denerim where he had a personal interest in frequently climbing into a second-story window. And rooftops had always made excellent escape routes when the guards had seen his hands wander a bit too much. So he wasn't unfamiliar with how to pick a vertical path. But it's raining, and higher than anything I've ever tried. I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't be a bit shaky. Garrot snorted a laugh. You lie? Never. Hello. Alistair's voice called behind them. What are you guys doing, enjoying the view? The Darkspawn army is through the door this way. Finian thought about that, then grinned at Garrot. He makes a good point. Darkspawn army's that way, so I'm going this way. The dwarf chuckled and pulled a rope out of his bag. Loop it around something and drop it back down. We're probably going to need to pulley the tin cans. Finian nodded and stifled a laugh as he glanced over at Alistair and Percival, both of whom were watching Garrot and Finian with baffled expressions. Alistair's expression, in particular, was something he wanted to get a painting of someday. Then, as Finian looped the rope around his shoulders for safekeeping and climbed up onto the windowsill, Alistair finally seemed to realize what they were planning. Hey. Are you insane? Honestly. Finian said with a grin. I've been called that from time to time. Then, he hopped up, his leather gloves catching onto the rain-slicked stone above the window. Carefully, he found a solid foothold on a broken brick, and started making his way up the wall. It took him a long time to pick his way up the side of the tower. The wind and rain buffeted at him, making him slip around more than he was honestly comfortable with. Once, a brick he was using as a foothold broke loose, and he listened to it clatter its way down the tower for several very long seconds. It was a long distance down. He swallowed. Finally, shaking with nerves, physical effort, and being soaked through, he reached the lip of the top of the tower, and what he saw there made him duck right back down again. The creature on the top of the tower was huge, with menacing, spiraling horns bursting from its head. It bent over the bodies of what had once been guards. As Finn watched, it tore off the leg of one corpse and closed its jaw around the limb. Armor and bone alike crunched under its bite. Maker's acrid but stench. Finian whispered. Then, he spotted the box that would light the beacon, right behind the beast. Shaking, Finian fought to remain still, far more still than he had ever been when hiding from guardsmen or angry alienage elders. His breathing seemed incredibly loud and ragged. Then, when the monster turned its back, its heavy footsteps were the thunderous sound they had heard 2 floors down. It seemed Finian pulled himself silently up over the lip of the tower, and took cover behind a broken bit of wall. He uncoiled the rope from around his shoulders with trembling fingers, and looped it around what had once been part of a decorative iron lattice work in a window. He slipped both ends of the rope over the edge, hoping the others had the sense to climb quietly. Garrot came up first, and, when he spotted the monster, the look on his face matched pretty closely with Finian's own. A moment later, he'd stepped sideways into a shadow and disappeared. Alistair was next, his chest plate tied to the rope so that he could pulley himself up, with help from Percival below. The ex-Templar was grunting with the effort of it, but Finian's frantic, shut up, gestures silenced him as soon as he came into view. Unfortunately, that was not soon enough. Even as Alistair reached solid ground, Finian heard the creature moving around behind them, coming closer. It had heard something, and was coming to investigate. Alistair spat a curse and started frantically pulling at the rope, trying to bring the last of their team up before things went south. This made him rather conspicuous, of course. As soon as the giant darkspawn rounded the broken wall, it would see him. "Hey, you ugly son of a nug!" a voice shouted from the other side of the tower. "You smell worse than my mother's breath. Take a bath." There was the sound of something shattering, followed by an acidic sizzle and a roar of pain. The monster thundered away from their hiding spot, and something smashed. The monster roared again, and there was the sound of a mighty slam. "Elf! A little help!" Finian jumped, realizing that he was just sitting there while Garrot faced that thing alone. Alistair was still pulling Percival up, his hands slipping on rain-coated rope in his haste. Finian was the only one who could do anything. He jumped up from behind the wall and rounded into the room. The chamber took up the entirety of the top floor, with a high ceiling that housed the beacon above them. Smashed crates and tables littered the floor, and the dwarf seemed to be doing his damnedest to use them to his advantage. Garrot was running for his life from the charging monstrosity behind him, the dwarf ducking between piles of rubble that only made decent cover for the 2 seconds it took the monster to swipe them aside. Finian gulped, the weight of his daggers suddenly feeling very insignificant. Still, Garrot was going to be crushed by a sweep of those powerful arms if Finian didn't do something. The elf and dwarf might have had their differences, but he was still a teammate, and Finian wouldn't let him down. Finian ran around behind the monster, not a difficult thing to do, since it seemed fixated on tearing Garrot into little dwarf pieces. Then, the elf leapt in and stabbed both daggers into one massive ankle. The creature growled and paused in its tirade, then kicked backwards, catching Finian in the stomach and sending him flying across the room. He landed roughly on the stone and rolled a good 10 feet before he stopped hard against a pile of broken crates. It was all he could do for a moment to breathe, even as the monster roared and charged through the debris toward him. And then Alistair was in front of the thing, bracing with his shield against the monster's momentum. The human, too, went flying when it hit him, and Alistair crashed into the debris next to Finian. The creature's charge had nonetheless been broken, though, and then Percival was there, plunging his sword deep into the monster's left side. The darkspawn swept an arm out like it was swatting a fly, and Percival was pushed a couple steps back, despite the swipe hitting his shield. "Well, this is nice," Alistair said, carefully levering himself to his feet. "Us getting together to fight for our lives, spending terrifying time together, we should do this more often." He reached down to help pull Finian to his feet, and the elf only winced a little. Somehow, he had kept hold of his daggers through the tumble. "We could invite the large guy along," Finn said. "Make it a real party." Alistair smiled wryly. Then, they both winced as Percival was knocked off balance by the monster pounding against the ground at his feet. The darkspawn picked up the noble by the chest plate, and might have done worse if Garrot's hand axe hadn't landed in its foot. The monster dropped the noble and started after the dwarf again, who turned and ran. "We've missed the signal for sure," Alistair said, face and voice serious. "Finian, you light the beacon. We'll try to keep it distracted." Finian nodded, disturbingly relieved not to have to get near that thing again. Then, Alistair charged toward the monster with shield raised, and Finian ran for the box of fuel that would light the signal. It was a compartment in the wall that connected up to the brazier above them. There was a tinderbox next to it, still somehow intact. His hands shaking, trying not to listen to the crashes and roars behind him, Finian lit the tinder. Then, he stoked the flame, blowing on it to encourage its journey up toward the top of the tower. Soon, the heat was too much for the elf, and he closed the compartment door. Only when he looked up and saw that the signal fire was blazing above them did he turn back to the battle. The monster was bleeding from a myriad of lacerations around its legs and thighs, but remained relatively unharmed about the head and shoulders. If anything, the cuts to its lower, more reachable half only seemed to make it angry. Alistair and Percival had taken up opposite positions on each side of the creature, each doing their best to hack one arm each to bits. It didn't seem to be working. Garrot seemed to have a broken nose, judging by how much he was bleeding from it, but he dodged around and between the monster's legs all the same, continuing to hack and stab at it. It seemed obvious to Finian, now, that Garrot's light little weapons were not going to be able to penetrate that tough hide. Finian frowned down at his own daggers, because his weapons weren't any better. The only place on this thing that they'd likely even be able to penetrate would be its eyeballs. The eyes. That might work. When the monster slammed both hands on the floor, creating a concussion that sent all 3 of his teammates sprawling, Finian started moving forward. He sprinted, jumping over a pile of debris so as not to break momentum. As he did so, he reversed his grip on his daggers to a backwards one. When he was right in front of the creature, the monster slowly straightening from its ground pound, Finian sprang. He stabbed downward with all his strength, and his daggers hooked onto the top of the monster's horned head as it rose from its crouch. It roared, and Finian felt its hot breath on his stomach. He kicked out and bent his knees to keep his legs firmly out of reach of the thing's jaws. One gigantic hand curled around his waist, and Finian moved frantically, yanking his daggers out of the creature's thick skull to bring them in again, this time with perfect accuracy. The monster roared as both its eyes were slashed clean through, and that hand around his waist tightened so violently that Finian felt something inside him crack. He gasped, but didn't have time to react, because he was suddenly whipped around, his head snapping forward with the force of it. Then, he was flying through the air at impossible speed. Until he hit something solid a moment later. There was a second where the only thing he was aware of was a ringing in his head, and he lost sight of the tower to a wave of blackness. Then, the pain rushed in. His leg, his back, his head, his ribs, oh maker, it all hurt so bad. He tried to cry out, but he couldn't seem to find the breath to fill his lungs with. Finian. Oh maker, don't you die on me too. Hands were on him, and everything they touched throbbed. He tried to whimper, but there was something in his lungs. A cough didn't clear it. Was that blood he tasted? He opened his eyes, and blearily registered the man kneeling over him. A golden halo in the firelight. More coming, Alistair's voice said from far away, or maybe he wasn't too far, and Finn was just hearing everything through water. We need to go. I'm not leaving anyone behind, Percival hissed. Percival was the figure above him. But where? The thought slipped away as another wave of pain rushed over him. Can he be pulleyed down? Not in that state, Garrot said, somewhere behind Finn. Bet that toss busted some ribs. It'd probably only make things worse. Then I'll carry him. Finian felt hands slide under him. In any other case, they'd have been overly gentle, but now, when one of them brushed his right thigh, agony shot through him and a strangled shriek left his mouth, despite lack of air. Blackness started closing in from the corners of his eyes. Maybe kinder to put him down quickly, the dwarf's voice grunted. You try it, and I run you through here and now. Then, more gently. Easy, elf. Just hang on. Someone was whimpering feebly. Finian thought it sounded like himself. He couldn't see anything anymore through the darkness. His whole body throbbed, a steady beat of pain to the rhythm of his heart. Oh blast it! Alistair's voice cried. Here comes round number. I can't even remember anymore. From far away, Finn heard the sound of steel being drawn, and there was a sensation of movement that faded as the rest of the world did. And over it wavered a frightened, fading voice, Don't die on me, Finian. Please, hang on. Check the description for the links to the author.